blending mode, different type of modes or options to blend and mix between different type of layers. If you can't see the blending mode column, click the button in the lower left corner of the timeline panel to show or hide it. Plus, specifically for this icon and the previous one on the left, we may additionally toggle or change between these two over on the right. After Effects categorizes these blending modes into 8 different groups: normal, subtractive, additive, complex, difference, HSL, in short for hue, saturation and luminosity, matte, and utility. I will throw in a background image I generated quickly with AI to help show the difference. From the current default or normal mode, we find the dissolve and dancing dissolve. They respond to the opacity or transparency and only for 2D layers. The difference is that only dissolve is constant over time, while the dancing one, well, kinda shows off its moves every frame. The darken mode from the subtractive category blends and displays the lower or darker values of the actual color channels, as here from the text layers and underlying image. Next up, multiply is the result of a multiply blend between the source image or the text layer here on top, divided by no more than the underlying color depth of the project, for example when using an 8 BPC or 8 bits per channel. Besides, it's a great mode if you have an image containing a lot of white that you want to hide, making it transparent, only showing the actual objects in the image blended with the background. Next, we got color burn, darkening the source color to match the underlying image. A classic variation of it, the same stuff but for old projects only. We may, for example, throw in a random video footage, add a vintage background paper on top, change it to color burn, and immediately getting this rough vintage look, and perhaps also spicing it up a little bit and make it a bit more interesting. Linear burn is quite similar to color burn with a slight difference in contrast. And last one in the category, darker color. Moving on to additive groups, and in contrast to the subtractive groups, this will instead lightening all the colors instead of actually darkening them. The first one, add, is a valuable mode if wanting to blend an image containing black parts or a background that you want to remove and blend with another one. Lighten, in contrast to the darken mode, instead blends and displays the higher or more brighter values of the color channels with the source and the underlying image. A bit similar to add, the screen mode also removes the dark parts, but tends to keep a bit more detail and doesn't create as much brightness as with the add mode. Use it when applying lens flare, dust waves, fire embers, or whatever you feel like smashing on top. Color dodge lightens the source layer based on the color values of the underlying layer, effectively lowering the contrast between the source and underlying colors by reducing the difference in brightness. The classic one, just another one of those for older projects. Linear dodge increases the brightness of the top or highlighted image to match the underlying. Very similar or close to identical actually to how add mode looks. Lighter color, very close to lighten mode with a slight variation in style. The fourth group, complex, gives a bit different result and variety to the blending depending on the image grayscale. So depending on if the image grayscale is above the 50% mark or below the 50% mark. And overall it also gives a little bit extra contrast to the image. Overlay combines the multiple with the screen mode. Basically all lighter colors for the underlying layer will become brighter and darker colors even darker. soft light, as in this case, the text or source layer is a lot higher than 50% gray on the grayscale, thus a lot brighter, giving a dodging or lighting effect to the underlying layer, compared if I were to use a source layer under 50% mark or darker, which would instead burn or darken the underlying image. Hard light is a more intense version of overlay and soft light, creating stronger highlights and shadows for the footage, where the brighter source image almost completely takes over the underlying image and the darker one is not far behind. Linear light uses brightness when blending, and if the hard light isn't enough, this one will probably raise it to another level. However, as for this one here, the hard light, and the one coming up next, the vivid light, you might be better off trying to avoid image or footage with a really high amount of white and black color within it. For example, try stylized background as that old vintage paper, or a similar one with maybe a splash of green. Vivid light takes it back down a bit in intensity, but gives that popping look, at least for this text layer, while the mode uses contrast instead of brightness. However, if applied to a darker or brighter image, it gets quite intense again, but works alright for the darker if it's a look you're actually after, we'll say. Otherwise, experiment with some other coloring. Pin light replaces colors dependent on the underlying colors being brighter or darker than the 50% grayscale, looking very similar to hard light. Hard mix is quite extreme as well and really pumps up the contrast to the max, giving this trippy look when limiting the color detail. Although it can be pretty cool to play around with some different type of masking and feathering to get a bit different look and effects out of these blending modes. Let's duplicate our background. Either go to Edit or press Ctrl if you're still on a PC, or Command on a Mac, plus D to duplicate. I will create a mask around the logo with the pen tool up in the toolbar. Then use the feather as you like to smoothen it and still get a heavy contrast look in the middle. Lower opacity if needed. Close the other layer. And perhaps duplicate more times. Whack in some light leaks, again with hard light mode to get that flashing light. Fire embers with the screen mode. And a bit of smoke on screen mode, I think, for atmosphere. Finally, sprinkle some film dust on the top for that raw vintage look. And hey, suddenly you're almost thrown right into an old school Marvel After Effects intro. Well, I did say almost. Next up we got the category of difference, where colors are created depending on the difference between the actual source layer on the top and the underlying image, and creating some type of quite cool, interesting looks. For the first difference mode, there's not that much going on with a clean text layer. But for the light and dark background image, it goes a bit crazy. Also, when adding those rough paper images, separately or perhaps together, a classic option here as well for older projects. Exclusion gives a very similar look to difference, but perhaps a bit less contrast and more washed out coloring, if you will. Subtract will remove or subtract the top layer color from the underlying one, and thus give a completely different look with less color and brightness. So actually, the brighter the source image is, the one on the top, or certain parts of it, the darker the areas on the underlying image will become. The last one in the category, divide, will function quite the opposite while making the underlying image brighter from darker parts, dividing the underlying color by the image on the top of the source. Category 6, and that is the HSL or hue, saturation and luminosity. Use any of those properties or a mix of all three of them to blend images with the underlying color. Depending on what you're after, it's possible to get some interesting visual color changes with the hue mode, as it uses the hue or the origin of color that we see from the source layer, then saturation and luminosity of the underlying layer or image. Saturation works similarly, but instead has a saturation or intensity of the colors from the top or source layer, while hue and luminosity from the underlying. While the color mode, both hue and saturation of source color and luminosity or perceived brightness from the underlying, try using this mode to add color to a gray image. By adding a colorful image with color mode on top. The last mode in the category, luminosity, which works as opposed or contrary to the color mode, has the luminosity from the source layer and the other two from the underlying, where darker parts of the underlying image turn the matching overlaying parts of the source image gray. There's just 2 more blending modes or categories coming up, and the next one will be the matte, which changes the top layer or the actual source layer into a matte for one or several underlying images or layers. Let's show this by applying the stencil alpha to the text layer blending mode comp and scaling the layer up quite a bit so you see the background layer through it as a transparent stencil. The stencil luma works a bit similar to stencil alpha, but transparency is based on the brightness of the source layer and reflects how transparent the stencil will become. Darker the source layer, the less transparent the stencil becomes. And as I'm using a text layer with the layer styles bevel and emboss, adding some depth and dimension to text or shapes by simulating shadows and highlights, creating a, light 3D appearance. Those shadows and highlights are included in this mode, but not the previous. Silhouette alpha mode makes the whole source layer transparent and anything below it. And this becomes even clearer when we toggle the transparency grid. To show anything below, you first need to pre-compose the source layer with, for example, the main background or first underlying layer. Let's name it text layer silhouette. Then you can see any layer under that new composition again. Just make sure that the collapse transformation is actually turned off. The last mode in the category, silhouette luma mode, now toggling or switching it on and off, you will see the effect turning on and off for the layers below. And yes, we're at that last category, the category or group 8 for the 2 final blending modes. And the first mode here is kind of a fix or a problem solver. Like if you ever come across when you do the masking and there's like a little thin line, like a seam turning up in the middle of the masking. And the next mode here is to actually be able to hide this one. For example, if I wanted to mask this layer with a pen tool, cutting it in half, to perhaps use 2 different effects on each layer or whatever reason you might have. Duplicating the layer, invert the mask on the new layer, and hide the mask and shape path visibility. Well, suddenly there's like this thin line all over the split area where the 2 layers and mask combine. And to fix this, change the blending mode to Alpha Add for the top layer and it will get it away. Then suppose you ever encounter any problems when you're importing or using the lens flare, getting clippings of color values or too bright edges when you're working with a pre-multiplied alpha channel. Well, in that case, the luminescent pre-mold blending mode can be a solution to it. Here it might also be worth changing the alpha interpretation of the footage, meaning how the data is being read or used. Right-click your image in the project panel, interpret footage, main, then if not done already, set it to straight unmatte, meaning that the RGB color channels and the alpha channels will be stored separately. A final tip here to switch faster between the blending modes and quickly see the effects of them, something that we see how under the top menu layer as next and previous blending mode. Go to next using the plus on your keyboard or shift minus for the previous mode. However, if you're like me and you're currently on a MacBook, this won't work properly. If so, go into Edit, Keyboard Shortcuts, search for blending mode, and in the very bottom we're able to either delete a previous keyboard shortcut and change to a new one, or just add an extra one clicking beside it and the keyboard shortcuts you prefer.